My name is Amanda Bucknia. My pronouns are she and her. A bit about me, my current role is working with Making the Shift as the manager of the Toronto Centre of Excellence on Youth Homelessness Prevention, which is our designation by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe as a charter centre of excellence. So really being that international megaphone on the incredible work that's happening across our networks. I also am a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph in an interdisciplinary program called Social Practice and Transformational Change. And really the way that I got to the point that I am is because I was a bit of a policy wonk. I started off connecting with this work and on my career and academic path by doing a Master of Public Policy at the University of Toronto and connecting up with Away Home Canada as a policy intern. So hopefully you'll all be inspired by our speakers today and come with questions and or just some things to think about, because it's a wide world of work to be in policy. It doesn't all look like one thing, and we're hearing from three people that have very unique and different pathways into policy. So I'll just get folks to introduce themselves briefly, and I'll start with Benicia.
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. My name is Benicia. My pronouns are she and her. I am Jamaican, and I've lived in Calgary for over 10 years before recently moving to London, England. I'm really excited for this session and to share my experiences and to learn from you all.
Thanks, Benicia. Over to Lisa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Wolf. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at UNICEF Canada. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples in the jurisdiction of the Williams Treaty, which is just north of Toronto. Looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Lisa. And Jasmine.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Jasmine Hayes. I use she, her pronouns. I am an executive director in child welfare and education with ICF, and joining you today from Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. Great to be here.
Excellent. So we're going to jump right into everything, and we're going to start with Benicia to tell us a bit about your story and your interest in government policy. How did you end up where you are, and what have you learned along the way?
Very big questions. I'll do my best. So I will start by saying a little bit more about where I am now, which I kind of glossed over initially, but I'm currently in London working at the Behavioral Insights team, or BIT. It was previously called the Nudge Unit when it was started in Cabinet Office and was focused on the application of behavioral science to public policy issues and overall policy and program service design. And I kind of sit within the growth team as a growth coordinator. So a little bit more about what BIT does is we work across a range of different policy areas, from sustainability and the environment to consumer behaviors, household finance, gambling, equity and diversity, all sorts of issues. And with the core of it being using behavioral insights to improve and develop public services, while also having an element of rigorous and robust evaluation to whatever interventions we design to address the range of policy issues that we work on. And so BIT has several kind of in-house methodologies that they use, one of them being tests, which is the idea of targeting a specific behavior that we want to change, exploring kind of the space in which and the context in which that behavior exists, developing solutions, testing those solutions, and then eventually scaling them. And so that's kind of how BIT works. My role sits a little bit outside of the policy focus. So within the growth team, the two main parts of my role are, one, focusing on supporting the policy teams as they bid for various public sector contracts. And so that's just one of the ways in which consultancies obtain contracts and work, is through public sector contracts, procurement and bidding. So I support policy teams through that process. And the other big part of my role is data and growth and analysis. So I kind of help develop a dashboard that kind of track all those opportunities in our pipeline, kind of summarize all our performance statistics, and also provide advice on how we can really improve our bidding performance and business development so we can perform better commercially. And so this part of my role has less policy elements to it. And the reason for that is because I really wanted to work at BIT when I graduated from my master's, and this was kind of the only role that was available. And so I said I would shoot my shot, try to get in, and then pivot to a policy team within a year. So I gave myself this kind of benchmark. I'm approaching the 1 year mark. So like some of you, I'm currently thinking about what comes next. But that's kind of where I'm at now, and certainly happy to take some more questions about that. But in terms of how I got there, so I studied political science in my undergrad at the University of Calgary, and I graduated in 2019. After my undergrad, I moved to Ottawa, where I did an internship in the Prime Minister's office through an internship program called the Summer Leadership Program. And so that was right in 2019. I supported their special projects and HR team, doing a range of different administrative, HR, finance, policy support work. It was very exciting and fun, as you can imagine, and a really great eye-opening experience about how government works. It was really interesting going from a political science degree, especially in Calgary, which has a very different landscape than Ottawa, and then moving to Ottawa and seeing how the entire machine operates. It's always true what they say, that what you learn in the classroom is very different than the real world. And that was just like, I got it right out the books. So after that internship, I stayed on and worked full time. And as that was 2019, we had the federal election of fall 2019. And so that was a particularly exciting period to be working there. So in government in Ottawa, once there is a federal election, kind of the political staff tend to leave Ottawa to go work on various political campaigns. And so I had the opportunity to stay in Ottawa and support the transition team throughout that period. And that was really a useful moment as well, because we went from being about 80 to 100 staff in the office to just 10 to 15 people. And at that time, the government wasn't thinking about introducing new legislation or making significant program changes, but making sure that government was operating as it should, and that we had the right mechanisms in place should anything happen and the Prime Minister needed to switch roles between being a party leader and the Prime Minister. And so that was a really interesting opportunity as well, and got the opportunity to work really closely with the Privy Council, which supports kind of the Prime Minister's office and helps and works across the different ministerial offices as well. And so that kind of happened, I guess, for about August to November, between, you know, when we were heading into election and post-election. And post-election, I think the most exciting time of working in Ottawa was when I supported with cabinet formation. So after an election, in this case, the Prime Minister won, but had it been the other leader, the process would have looked a little bit differently. But because we were the current government at the time, it made the transition period a lot easier, but it was still an intense process of restarting government again. And so we had the process of selecting different ministers, and ministers engage into this rigorous process of being selected and thinking about how we were going to create different ministerial mandates and setting government priorities, and all these different things all happen within the span of several weeks after an election. So that was really interesting as well. And definitely from a policy perspective, I think oftentimes when you approach policy, especially from an academic space, you have time and in government, and often as soon as you leave kind of academia, the privilege of time really goes out the window sometimes, because you have to make decisions in short time periods. So you really get a sense of, you have to trade different priorities constantly and trying to think of what's in the best interest of people, which isn't always easy. And so that was, again, really thrown into the wolves as like recently out of undergrad into this space, but it was very exciting and I learned a lot and got lots of value of experience from it. And so after the election and that kind of support ended, I moved over to the Associate Finance Minister's office and stayed there for a couple months, supporting the Chief of Staff and the Director of Policy, and doing a range of different kind of things. So Minister Fortier, who I was supporting at the time, was the associate finance minister. So as she wasn't the finance minister, her role kind of looked differently. And so kind of working with ministers, depending on where they sit in terms of core portfolios, will indicate the type of work that you'll do. And so a lot of what we did at the time, she was given this mandate to think about how we can improve our policy making from a wider range of perspectives. So thinking about things like well-being and inclusive growth and how that can really come through in our policy making. So at the time, we did a lot of like stakeholder engagement with the OECD and various other countries, including New Zealand, to try to understand how they approach this idea of inclusive growth and how we can learn from them. So that was a different side to things, of where we didn't have the time pressure and had the opportunity to really think about developing something. And shortly after that, we had the pandemic. And so that kind of changed our focus quite a bit. And immediately the focus was on response and supporting various stakeholders and sectors across Canada. And after 8 months or so, I left government and pursued my Master's of Public Policy at Oxford, and graduated from that in 2021, so last year, and then returned to London earlier this year to my current role. I just want to flag, Amanda, how am I doing on time? I've kind of doing good. Great. So so I talked about my current role a bit, I guess, throughout all of that. So it's been just over 3 years since I've graduated from my undergrad. The biggest challenge was really deciding whether to move to Oxford to do my master's in the middle of a pandemic, and leaving the security of having my job in Ottawa and being very comfortable in that space, and learning lots and doing all those things. And kind of reflecting back, it's hard to say like what exactly was the reason. Like I wrote down here, like it felt right, which is not very useful advice. But I think sometimes that's definitely part of the decision making. I did weigh up the pros and cons, and I knew I wanted to leave government because I felt like I kind of was approaching a plateau where I had useful experience, but I really wanted to ground my approach to policy in evidence and an understanding and knowledge and expertise. And I didn't feel like I would be able to get that kind of experience as quickly as I wanted to. And so that was one of my main reasons for wanting to go back and do my master's. And then I also knew that I couldn't get exactly what I needed in the roles that I was pursuing. So those are kind of the two things I was weighing up. Obviously, doing your master's can be an expensive endeavor. So that was also a big criteria as well. But in the end, kind of when I weighed everything up and was thinking about how I felt, and also having an incredible opportunity and not knowing if I would get the opportunity again, I decided to pursue it. I do think it was the right decision. It certainly hasn't been easy studying in a pandemic and graduating and whatever, but I think a year later, things have certainly changed. And we can touch on this a little bit later, but I find compared to when I graduated last year and looking at the job market and engaging with it, I found this year there's way more opportunities. And in the UK, I'm not sure how it compares to Canada, but the employment vacancy is much higher than it's been in years. And so that really does create opportunities to really branch out. And I kind of do think it's a good time to really be curious. And if you're thinking about jumping into a new career path or just switching roles, it can be a really good time. But just to wrap up on some other things that I think are quite useful, being in this place of career exploration, is to not self-reject. I think oftentimes you might think, oh, I don't have enough experience, or I don't know enough about this, or I'm too young, or I'm too old, or whatever, but really just go for it. It's an advice that people say often, but we really do second guess ourselves and doubt ourselves way more often than we should. Doesn't mean that you'll get all the opportunities that you apply for, but it does help to keep putting yourself out there and getting used to the process and building confidence in that way. But also sometimes you'll be surprised at the outcome as well. So definitely don't discount yourself. I think also LinkedIn is a really good tool. I'm still learning about how to use LinkedIn. You do have the privilege of getting a 1 month free trial. So I would say lean into that of the Prime membership when you can. So and through the premium, I think it's particularly useful because you can engage with different folks on LinkedIn that you might not be connected with. But even if you don't use premium, I think it's a really good place to look at folks in careers that are of interest to you, look at how they talk about their careers, look at their previous experience. And the nice thing about LinkedIn, it is a social media platform. So the algorithm registers what you're looking at. So the more you engage with folks in the field that you're interested in or organizations that you like to work at, you'll be constantly be fed similar stuff. And so that exposes, broadens your exposure. But the other thing is really to be brave and try new things. Sometimes you might do something, you don't like it, it doesn't work out. But even the idea of doing it and learning that it's not for you is really good. So leaning into that, I can say with this role, that's certainly what I did. And I did learn quite a lot, but I don't think it's for me, and that's okay. And the flip side of that is being brave and knowing when to walk away. I think the kind of job market, the professional world has changed a lot. And so you don't have to be in a role for, 10 years as my parents would, or, your parents may have. So being able to say, I think I've done all I can in this role. I've learned all I can. I feel like I'm maybe getting a little bit too comfortable. I don't feel stretched. I don't feel challenged, and seeking opportunities to bring that challenge in, or saying, well, perhaps I can look elsewhere. And that can be difficult, especially as costs of everything are rising and people want to be comfortable. But when you can, it's certainly good to kind of explore new opportunities. But I also think making a plan in the midst of this is really helpful. So try not to do things on a whim. I mean, you can certainly go with the wind at times, but you can get the best out of some of these opportunities the better you have a plan and an idea of what you really want. And then you can make the most out of the opportunities that you do have. So I will leave it there. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Benicia. Wow, what a whirlwind time for you to be in the PMO, and dealing with the pandemic, such a very fast getting up to speed with what government's like. And also cool to hear that you're in the previously known as nudge unit. When I was doing my Master of Public Policy, nudge and behavioral science and how that was influencing policy was all the rage. So I would love to talk about that more. But I'm going to pass it over to Lisa now to share about her experience. And if you have any questions or comments as well, feel free to throw them into the chat or into the Q&A box. We'll take up everything at the end, and I'm keeping track of what people are saying. So yes, I'll turn it over to you, Lisa.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Venetia. It was really interesting to hear about where you've come at the really what's the start of your career. I'm at I think the other end of the spectrum. I'm heading into probably the last years of my official career, and so I'll pick up on some actually similar themes that Venetia raised and offer some reflections, but I'm still learning about how to get things done and benefiting from advice, which never gets old or cold, no matter where you are in your career. I'll just start with telling you a little bit about my role and the sector I work in. So I work within UNICEF, which is the United Nations Children's Fund. It is a UN agency, so we get our mandate from the member government states, including Canada. But in wealthy countries, defined by the World Bank as being high-income countries, we don't do the same things that UNICEF does in low and middle-income countries, where we enter into cooperation agreements with governments to build systems for children and youth, whether it's justice systems, health systems, data systems, whatever is needed in the country, and we transfer resources. In rich countries, we don't operate the same way when we're not UN employees. We're constructed differently, and rich countries have the resources that they need to do what they should be doing for children and youth. What's often insufficient is the political will to give children and youth a priority in budgets and on the policy agenda. And that's where advocacy comes in. So our focus as UNICEF in rich countries is policy advocacy. And I lead our domestic mission work for Canada's children, for and with Canada's children and youth. And I think UNICEF in the child and youth sector in Canada has some unique distinctions in that we focus on children from prenatal right through to adolescence up to the age of 18, the holders of rights in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We work across a wide variety of issues because children's human rights, which is the DNA of our mission, working to secure those rights in Canadian policy, legislation, budgeting, and so on, that's a broad framework. So we don't focus on child injury or even child health. We don't focus on just child protection or justice. We deal with a range of rights, and we have to work really hard as a small team of 4 people to always be synthesizing where, the evidence, situation analysis, political landscape, the stakeholder landscape, and understand where we can add value, where we can be strategic. And the areas then that we focus on where Canada has some of the greatest deficits and the greatest opportunity, especially relative to what we see in other high income countries and where we know we're investing, is in social protection policies that benefit children and youth. So working to continue to reduce child and youth poverty, to expand early childcare and education, to improve parental leave so that no child is left out of that protected time in the first months of life. That's really the trifecta of what we call family-friendly social protection policies, and they have a lot of impacts on a wide range of child and youth outcomes. So we focus there, and we focus on what are kind of uniquely rights-based policy areas. We call them the child-sensitive governance mechanisms. So we're working with different jurisdictions, both governments and stakeholders, on the adoption of child rights impact assessment, a child policy lens in government decision-making, strengthening the role of independent advocacy offices for children and youth. These are the accountability mechanisms that are associated with working with human rights that makes working with rights different. And so that's another secondary area of our focus. And we involve young people in our work very deeply as well. And so that's just a sense of the work that we do. But again, it makes us a little bit unique, working with rights, working across the age span from prenatal to adolescence, being a national as well as a global organization. How did I get here? One thing I should tell you is that I've been with UNICEF since almost the start of my career. So I'm one of those people, like maybe some of your parents, that have been with an organization for a very long time, and it's a rather unusual place to be. But it's such a great organization. I've never wanted to leave, and the reason I've stayed is that my role has actually changed within the organization, and I've actually stepped back and done other things in between changing roles. So there's always been an opportunity to learn and change and grow, and that's why I'm still here and love the organization, love the work I do. It's not to say there have not been challenges, and that's one of the things I'll talk about. It's always a winding road, even if you're in the same organization, because it's not the same organization I work in now than when I started. So there's a lot of skills that come with staying fresh, relevant, and impactful, and dealing with the roller coaster, that is work in any given organization. So where I started from was an undergraduate degree in environmental studies. And I love the subject matter, learning about how ecosystems work and how human systems, work within the larger ecosystem that we share, that's our common home. I just love that subject matter. And I entered into it without any predetermined vision of a specific career. I just really liked the subject matter. And I was confident and optimistic that I'd find something that interested me and figure that out during the 5 years of university to get my honors degree, but also being in a co-op program, which helped a lot. To figure out what I liked and didn't like and try different things. So, in that space, I could have been an urban planner. I could have worked in ecosystem protection, in a national park. In fact, my research focused on climate change impacts in Canadian wetlands, which is pretty different than working on child poverty reduction in some ways. And in fact, one of my co-op work terms was in a national park, and I lived in a trailer for 4 months at one point with a lot of mice, and it was interesting work, but not ultimately what I decided I want to do. I was kind of an urban girl, so that was a great experience though. When I completed that degree, I went into a master's of education, because by then I thought that I wanted to be a teacher. And to be fair, my whole family is full of teachers. The only one who hasn't been a teacher in my family is my youngest brother, who went into business. So we call him the black sheep of the family. So, teaching was just kind of part of my DNA. And I thought I'd try it out. Well, I really didn't like it. I love the young people, but I'm a bit of an introvert, and, having to work with 90 or 100 different people every day was a very taxing experience for me. It just wasn't for me. So when I had the opportunity to move back from where I was teaching to Toronto, I found that UNICEF was advertising a role that actually was really related to education. They had an education directorship where the mandate was to work with school boards and education institutions in Canada to advance global citizenship and child rights education in the curricula and in broader programming. And so that's what I started to do. And that's where I came into UNICEF. And it was interesting because, again, I was, coming from an environmental studies background. I remember speaking to one of my colleagues when I first started to say, well, where is UNICEF on the climate change file? What are we doing, to create more resilience or adaptation or to climate, or to work on climate policy as it affects children? And I was told, climate, that's not UNICEF's business. We don't worry about climate. We're worried about meeting basic needs and nutrition and health and so on. And I just flip forward to tell you that UNICEF is very active in climate policy today. So that was kind of interesting. And I'm thrilled to be able to work on that now. But one of I think the interesting things was, I started at UNICEF in this education role, and I left after a number of years to consult in government, actually, on child rights programming, because I'd become more and more adept, I guess, and skilled and knowledgeable about the human rights framework and working with rights, not just in education policy, but more broadly. But I came back to UNICEF Canada when the organization decided to formalize the work that it does in high-income countries on policy advocacy. So it created, I had an opportunity actually to build from the ground up a program of policy advocacy for children's rights. And I think, this was a different entry point into policy than, say, Benicia has, who came from a Master of Political Science or an education in political science, and working in government. For me, it was the reverse. I came into policy advocacy with a strong grasp of the subject matter that we wanted to advocate for, but I had to learn the political system and the policy making process. And people come into policy advocacy often with that government background and the political science background, and then learn the subject matter, or apply it to different subjects throughout their career. They might be working on for Mothers Against Drunk Driving in one job and injury prevention in another, and the skills are transferable. But for me, I had to learn that political process, and I'm still learning, and it hasn't been easy, but I don't think there's any one right way to go about your career. You have nimble, agile skills that are transportable and transferable. I think, one current challenge in this work continues to be managing the heavy call on UNICEF to deal with different children's rights issues with a small team, and figuring out where we add the best value with the resources that we have, always wanting to do more as a natural advocate. One place I would like to go from here is, and I don't know if I will do this within my career or maybe after I retire, but I would like to shift downstream, actually, from policy, which changes systems for lots of kids, down to working more directly with children and youth. And in the community I live in, there's lots of programs where I can do that. And it's just sort of, a desire that I have at this point, is to work more directly hands-on with children and youth, and go the other way. So just a couple thoughts, to wrap up on what I learned and what I'm continuing to learn, because you can't stop learning and getting better at your job, no matter, even if you've got the same title for a number of years. Your colleagues, your employers, your stakeholders, the people you work for, in my case, children and youth, are going to expect you to continue to innovate, get better at what you do, try new things. Well, I guess there's three things I would just leave you with in terms of my insights. When it comes to leadership, just keep in mind that leadership isn't necessarily attached to your title. In our culture, in a westernized culture, we think that continuing to move up a hierarchy, a pyramid in an organization, is the ultimate in leadership. But that may not be something you're interested in. You might want to try that out, but you might find you don't like people managing, and you'd rather just focus on the substance of your work. Try different things, but honor the work that you love doing. And if you love the work you do, you're going to be able to weather the ups and downs and sleep well at night, by and large. I think that leadership, often looks like taking a back seat and letting others shine, being a very respectful partner to other organizations, rather than having a competitive orientation, and finding your unique value added. I think that when it comes to skills, again, over time, I've had to learn a lot about how to work with young people in a respectful way, about respecting diversity and inclusion, and making that a priority in everything that we do. Learning digital skills, and always working on your relationships with your colleagues, and how to be a good colleague, whether people are reporting to you, whether you're working collegially across the organization. I think the second thing that, or maybe it's the third now, the third thing I would just say where my reflections have led me is, it's an axiom and maybe a bit of a cliche to say that obviously we can't control everything in our lives except our attitude and our behaviors. And life will throw you many twists and turns. Your career certainly will, even within one organization. Again, it's an organization that's constantly changing. Some changes are good and some are not so welcome. I think that the behaviors that have worked really well for me over time, and have probably, fueled the arc of my career to be consistently in work I like to do for an organization I like to work with, are responsiveness, just hard work, being responsive to your colleagues, to your stakeholders, not letting them down, not letting timelines go. That sounds like nuts and bolts, but boy, is it important to be diligent and responsive. And I think being optimistic knowing that I might not like certain situations right now, but they're going to change and they're probably going to get better. So I'm having the grit to stick out things when times get tough, the fortitude to get through that. And knowing when, if it's just not getting better, then, maybe leaving is right, but knowing that things will always be changing and those changes are sometimes good and sometimes not so good. I think that learning and adaptation are always going to be key. I've mentioned that. Constantly read your sector, absorb information. That takes a lot of your personal time. It takes a lot of effort that others won't notice necessarily that you're doing, but it's really going to situate you well to do your job well, to always shine, and to be a desired employee and a desired partner and good at what you do. So maybe I'll end with that, and looking forward to picking up the discussion.
That's great, Lisa. Really cool to hear another perspective of the policy advocacy side of things. And that's a whole other world of policy making, and important world, and a place that often, just like yourself, many people find themselves working in policy that maybe they didn't see themselves on that career trajectory initially. I'm going to pass it over to Jasmine now to share about your experience.
Great, thanks. So I'm definitely hearing some common themes from my colleagues. So let me start with where I am, and then I'll go back to how did I get here. So I am with a company called ICF International. It is a global company, about 9,000 employees, believe it or not. And I think we have over 70 offices worldwide. And I think we actually have one in Toronto on University Avenue. So my role is I am a project director. My official title is Executive Director, Child Welfare and Education. And I'm a federal contractor. So the project that I oversee is called the Capacity Building Center for States. And we are a contractor to the federal government, specifically to the Children's Bureau. The Children's Bureau oversees all public, state, and territorial child welfare agencies in the country. And our role as the Capacity Building Center for States is to serve as the technical assistance arm of the Children's Bureau. So that means we are charged with supporting state child welfare agencies with the implementation of federal policies to support improved outcomes for children, youth, and families. So it's very much that intersection of policy and practice, as well as opportunity for innovation, and it spans the continuum of child welfare. We have had this project since 2014. The structure of technical assistance to child welfare in the United States up until 2014 consisted of I would say, a rather disparate network of national resource centers that were focused on particular topics. So you might have a national resource center on permanency, or a national resource center on child protection, and one on youth development, and so forth. And then the challenge, of course, is none of these issues happen in isolation, right? So if you're a child welfare agency, that then put you in the position of having to access resources from multiple centers, which became really confusing and difficult to manage. So the federal government reorganized that structure into one capacity building collaborative, which includes my project, we're the Center for States. They have a Center for Tribes and a Center for Courts. And so those comprise the three parts of the collaborative. And we are working constantly across and in collaboration with one another. So it could be that some of my team members are working with partners from the Center for Tribes around an issue that is impacting a tribal partner, or we could be working in partnership with the Center for Courts, because we also know that the court system is an integral part of the child welfare system and has to be a partner at the table. I have been in this role for just over 2 years. I joined in 2020. Never thought I would be a federal contractor. My previous role, I was the deputy director of a federal agency. And so I'm going to go back to the beginning to explain, well, how did you get to the role you're in now? So I am originally from Canada. I have dual citizenship. I moved to the US in 2002, which means I was born and raised in Canada. I received my undergrad. I did a BA in sociology and then a master's in social work from U of T, and started my career as a practitioner. I'm a social worker by training, have always been in the child welfare sector. Started as a frontline worker, um, engaged in child protection. I had opportunities to work with the Catholic Children's Aid Society. I was in the Intake and Investigations Division. Also had opportunities to be with the Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Center at Sunnybrook. And that really gave me the kind of the core, I think, of who I am when I think of myself really as a practitioner. I also, though, and this was sort of my intro, I think, into the policy world and the impact of policy and research on practice. While I was doing my master's, I was able to work with, at the Faculty of Social Work, Dr. Nico Chokmi, who was at the time with the Center of Excellence for Child Welfare. He is now at McGill. But I had the opportunity to become a research associate and worked with him around the data collection for the Canadian Incident Study of Reported Child Abuse and Neglect, the CIS, in which we were tracking over 700 families in both the Catholic Children's Aid and Toronto Children's Aid societies. And this was really looking at outcomes of investigations. It gave me an opportunity to participate in developing data collection spreadsheets and understanding data analysis, doing some statistical analysis. I was also able to co-author a book chapter on the intersection of domestic violence and child welfare, and then co-authored a series of fact sheets analyzing the data. So those are the kinds of things when you are thinking about decisions, right? It's taking up opportunities, even though that was something I wasn't really sure I would be interested in or even felt like I necessarily had the skills to do at the time, kind of taking advantage of those opportunities. And it really started to thread the needle for me as I thought about, okay, where do I go next in my career? And kind of that work with the Center of Excellence for Child Welfare really got me focused on child welfare as a career and the intersection of policy and research on practice. I moved to the US in 2002 and started with the city of Alexandria, which is just outside of DC, with their Division of Social Services. And I was a caseworker responsible for CPS investigations and family assessments. I was part of a pilot unit in which we carried all cases. So typically the structure in child welfare is that you will have workers who are responsible for intake and investigations. You might have some, if there's a differential response, then you might have some that are doing family assessments. You might have some that provide in-home services, then foster care and adoption. We were part of a pilot that wanted to see what would it look like if the same worker carried a case throughout the life of that case, largely because they were looking for changes in engagement and outcomes, right? Rather than having a young person or a family have to experience multiple workers, having to retell their story multiple times, having some of that stability across their involvement with child welfare. What that did was give me a really good sense of the difference in practice and policy in each of those different domains in child welfare. And what I began to realize is while I loved the direct practice part of the work, I was seeing the impact of policies and seeing sometimes those policies clearly were not being implemented the way they were intended, or the outcomes were certainly not what was initially intended. And I wanted to be on the other side of that. I wanted to be part of the group of people. I couldn't feel like, who are these people that are writing policy? I want to be there. So I had an opportunity to then go to the District of Columbia's Child and Family Services Agency. And I moved into the role of planning specialist. So this was, again, brand new for me. It was a risk, right? I was very comfortable in my lane of being a case-carrying social worker, but I had a great mentor and supervisor who really encouraged me to take that leap. And so I did, and I became the lead planner. I was assigned to manage our agency's response to areas of substance abuse, domestic violence, and mental health. Those are areas that cut across child welfare. And so then I moved into the program and policy development, working with both our program staff and external stakeholders. So that meant now I actually was able to be part of the group of folks putting pen to paper on developing our state and local, because DC is small, so we serve as both local and state policy office, being able to actually develop our policy for our agency. I was then assigned the role of being the liaison to the Federal Children's Bureau, right? So that meant I was charged with developing our annual progress and services report on behalf of my agency and leading all of our strategic planning. So now this is another element of the policy process. From the planning specialist role, I moved into the role of resource development specialist. So now I have the opportunity to begin to build out our programming, right? So we understand policy now. Policy has intent behind it. It's outlining, this is how we think we should do the work. And now I'm able to build out the kinds of programs that are going to really support that policy implementation. I then had an opportunity to move into the role of program administrator over the planning, quality improvement, and program support functions of the agency. So this was now managing senior staff across 8 program areas, including the policy unit. So all of my work was very much focused on local and state policy. What I began to see is, okay, that's great, but there's still a disconnect with what's happening at the federal level, right? Because state policy is informed by federal policy. And I was still seeing a gap and thinking, how am I going to get to that federal level? So it was a matter of putting myself in places where I could present what we were doing at the state level, being able to highlight that as some of the best practices. And then when an opportunity came up in the federal space to go to the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, I took that opportunity. And while initially some people said, well, that's completely out of your lane, right? You're all child welfare. What are you doing in homelessness? And to me, it was a natural transition because homelessness, housing instability, lack of housing affordability absolutely contributes to family involvement with child welfare. So for me, this seemed like the perfect fit. And so when I moved into that role, I was the policy director for children and family policy, focused on efforts to prevent and end homelessness. I was there in that role for a couple of years and then transitioned into the deputy director role. So I oversaw all of our policy work as well as our federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. So I was at USICH from 2014 to 2020. So if you're familiar at all with US politics, you'll see these dates will ring a little familiar, right? So I joined under the Obama administration and then a transition happened. So when we think about challenges, when we think about roadblocks, especially in policy, politics is a big piece of that, right? So I joined an agency whose values, their approach to policy was very much aligned with me. I'm very mission driven. That really influences and informs decisions I've made along the way about career opportunities and where I try to engage. And things were coming to a head, right? I had a strong disagreement with the political leadership about their policy and approach to addressing homelessness. And so found myself in this very strange predicament, right? That here I am as a career deputy director, was a career position. The director position was a politically appointed position. So my previous director was fired by the previous administration. They appointed a new person where I just had a fundamental disagreement. And so I think it was mentioned earlier, sometimes you have to really think about the environment in which you're working, right? Your values, what is your line? And, you know, at the same time, there's privilege in that, right? Like I've had to recognize that I had the privilege to be able to say, okay, I'm no longer willing to be in this environment. I'm going to move to another opportunity. And so that's what brought me to where I am now. In many ways, it feels like I've kind of come right back around because I'm focusing once again on child welfare. But what I bring into that role is the policy experience. And honestly, that connection to me is so critical of the research, the policy, and the practice. And that is something that I look for when I am hiring for policy specialists. I really do look for that practical experience. Not to say everyone has to be a practitioner, but really being able to highlight the understanding of the impact of policy directly on those that we are really intending to help or support. So I'm going to stop there because I know we want to try and have a chance for Q&A.
It's wonderful, Jasmine, and really cool to hear, like, very different pathways. Some people know from the beginning that they're on track to work in politics and government and policy. That's their passion. Some people find themselves in it and go, oh, okay, this is what I'm doing now, like getting into the advocacy work. And sometimes it really is like seeing and developing. There's no kind of one point in your career that you could end up working in policy. It's not like if you don't do political science, you can't go into policy. If you don't have any experience working in the policy process or with government, like the doors aren't closed to you. And in fact, I would say that policy making benefits from diverse disciplines and experiences, lived experiences, really informing that policy development and advocacy, whether you're inside or outside of government. So it's really awesome to hear all of your different experiences. I don't see any questions in the chat or the Q&A right now, but I wonder if any of you have questions for each other. I mean, I think it's also really interesting to hear because everybody's been working through policy, through various changes, whether changes in government. Maybe I could kick us off with a question around how do you navigate, like what is the process of working through policy when times are difficult, when you're not getting the traction that you want around a policy issue, when you're not getting the leadership that you're hoping for? How do you, like, if you have stuck around, what makes you decide to stay? If you decide to leave, what are some of those indicators that it's time to move on? I know it is a privilege to be able to say I'm going to choose a different career path, but I think that is something that when people think about the career in government, they're looking at who's in leadership. Could I actually work for a government that's misaligned for me? And if so, what would I be doing? Maybe I can open that up for folks if you have any thoughts on that question.
I'm happy to start off. I will say, for me, my experience as a former career in those spaces was to always find your career champions, because the reality is the politicals come and go, right? It's every few years they're going. But the folks that are really doing the work, the sustainable work, those are the career staff. And in times where there may be misalignment with the federal policy, there are still opportunities to do work. And what we did in my case is we kind of shifted our focus, and we knew that there was misalignment at the federal level and we weren't going to win on that. So I kind of let that go. And where I had my team focus was, let's work directly with the states in a more intentional way, right? Because at the end of the day, the work happens at the local and state level. So let's focus on supporting them, guiding them, making sure they have what they need, whether it's bringing new policy forward at that level. That's where we were able to still feel like we were mission driven, that we were aligned with our mission and vision for our work, and just being able to pivot as needed.
You say you've got a comment too?
Yeah, maybe I'll build on that. Similarly, in my experience working on children's rights in Canada, we found that sometimes different orders of government are a bit more progressive and willing to take risks. And, we have a federated state with shared responsibility for children. When it comes to our work on child rights impact assessment, we actually found a toehold in working with the New Brunswick government, where we made some early progress really quickly. And we were able to position that as sort of a demonstration for other provinces and territories. And now we're working across different provinces and territories, based on that model. And finally now with the federal government, it took longer to get there. So sometimes, knowing, who's contributing to the policy changes that you want to make, and maybe being agile to shift to where there's readiness, and be persistent, in terms of the more challenging time, long time cycles that certain governments might take. And as a nonpartisan, apolitical organization, we always work to find ways with the sitting government to get things done for children and youth. And all governments will profess to care for children and youth. So it's often a matter of how do you position the solutions that you're aiming towards that will have some clearer resonance with the policy paradigms of the sitting government. I could go into more detail about that if you like, but usually there's a way that you can try to find. I'm sure there's some exceptions in certain policy agenda, on certain policy agendas where it would be more difficult depending on the sitting government. But we've always found a way to make some progress by being very clear about that policy paradigm that the sitting government has, their agenda, and how you can position your agenda as analogous to that.
Thanks, Lisa. Benicia, any other thoughts or ideas being in the thick of working within government?
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much more to add, but I was thinking along the lines of Lisa as well in terms of framing your kind of position to align with whatever your intended audience, because in order to get buy-in, you really have to be thinking about who's at the table, what do they want, how does that align with what I want. But I think the idea of work, so in government, you can either be on the political side or on the civil service, the bureaucratic side. And I think Jasmine kind of touched more on the bureaucracy, but I think definitely on the political side, oftentimes when you go in, it's you are given a mandate and you have to follow that. And so within that, you might be, trying to build coalitions with perhaps other MPs or other ministers to try to get the momentum that you need to push an agenda forward. So I think the framing of it, but also building coalitions and really thinking about who your partners are, who could really move the needle. Like if I get this one minister on board, how will they help me to push this along? So it's being as strategic and kind of as analytical as you can be in that process to get the momentum that you need. But it's more of definitely working on the political side. It's thinking more, I don't want to say it's like a game, but like the game theory of doing that process really comes into play.
For sure. Thank you both. And Jasmine had to jump off for another call, but that was really insightful. And I think a few key takeaways as we wrap up, and I'll pass it to Pravina to close. But just I think having some kind of a plan is good. If you're interested in policy, starting to explore what the options are, see it, you don't have to do a master of public policy to go into it, but it may be something you're interested in. And I think there are folks on this call that would be willing to share about their experiences getting into that kind of field. But either way, also being open to the opportunities. You may not see yourself as a person wanting to work in policy now, but that may be where you end up. So having some idea of what that world looks like could be helpful to you. And I think these, all of you sharing your experiences today have been really helpful for folks to see what that could look like over the trajectory of their career from beginning to end. So